Okay. So welcome everyone. So let's start talking about evaluation for regulation in digital health. So some of you may be more experienced in doing evaluation, some of you may be less experienced. That's fine. We'll try and do something useful for everyone. I think it's important to start by thinking about why are we doing evaluation and what is evaluation? Evaluation is always a pragmatic compromise between what we could call methodological rigor and real-world practicalities. That is, you live in a real world, it's difficult to access patients, you have a limited budget, so what's practically doable might be limited, but at the same time, we try and do evaluation in a rigorous way that's going to ensure that we get sensible, reliable answers. Evaluation is not a one-off. You don't just do one evaluation and that's it. It's part of an iterative process that during the development of your product, you're doing evaluation. Before you get to the regulatory journey, you're doing evaluation. As part of getting regulatory approval, you're doing evaluation. In terms of further development of the product after you've achieved regulatory approval, you're doing more evaluation. What sort of evaluation you're doing at different times is going to vary, but evaluation should be an ongoing activity, not a one-off. Your evaluation to get you through regulation should not be the first time you've done any sort of evaluation of your system. You should have some idea that your system works well before you even get to what you need to do for regulation. But it might be that the evaluation you need to get regulatory approval is very different to what you've done previously. And we'll get into the details of the different sorts of evaluation methods later. I wanted to flag up some very useful resources. Wonderful though we can't tell you everything you need to know in an hour. But there are a bunch of useful resources that will give you more information about how to evaluate digital health technologies. So one very useful document is from NICE, the Evidence Sciences Framework for Digital Health Technologies. You can find that online. It's quite long, but it has lots of explanatory notes, so it does explain what's going on, and it lays out some guidance of what sort of evaluation is needed for what sort of products. Basically, it's using a risk stratification, so that products which have a greater chance that if they go wrong, they could harm patients need more evidence that they work, whereas something that's just, say, doing some sort of administrative task, which probably wouldn't need to go through any MHRA regulation, equally NICE would say, well, that doesn't need so much in the way of any evaluation. So that's a useful starting point. But it is not the easiest document always to read. And so a few years back, the government, or specifically Public Health England, as then was, commissioned this. So this website is the Evaluating Digital Health Products website, which I worked on and Paulina worked on. It's now run out of the Department of Health, particularly their Office for Health Improvement and Disparities. This is a website that lays out the basics of how you evaluate digital health products. It doesn't particularly focus on what you need to do for regulation. It's a more general background, but it does have all sorts of useful material, and I highly recommend it. But then I wrote a lot of it, so I would say that, wouldn't I? In particular, the website recommends using a product model as your starting point before you think about any evaluation. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. When we get to evaluation for regulatory approval, there are a number of different sorts of evaluations you might need to do, but all of them want you to be clear on the scope of your digital health product and its purpose. So they talk about intended use. So particularly at an early stage of development, sometimes, you come up with an idea, you pivot, you change what that idea is. When you're getting to regulation, you need to have a very clear idea, which you can state and write down as to what it is your product is claiming to do and how it does that. And so within that, you're going to need some sort of technical validation, which aligns with a number of international standards, which I'm not going to go into in detail, but they're there if you want to look at them. You're probably going to need some sort of clinical validation, which might involve a prospective study or a retrospective study. You need something on human factors, so which might have been answered by usability testing. And you also need to talk about post-market surveillance. You need to talk about, well, how do we make sure that once the product goes into use, it remains safe and effective? So that's a brief overview. Gareth's going to come back and talk more about a lot of that later. I want to focus initially, though, on this clinical validation. That's the sort of big bit that people normally worry about. It's probably the bit that's going to cost you most, probably going to be the bulk of your expense. So your application to the MHRA, we're focusing on the MHRA in a UK context, but the same basic ideas apply for the EU, and the EU rules also exist in Northern Ireland. It applies for the US, it applies for the Gulf, and so forth. Your application needs to be clear on the intended use of your product. Having a product model, which is basically just a type of a logic model, helps you clarify what your product or service does. So that's a good starting point. Once you're clear on what your thing does, that implies what outcomes you're probably going to want to evaluate. And once you know what your product does and what the outcomes you want to evaluate are, that's going to imply how you do your evaluation in terms of the exact outcome measure and what sort of methods are going to be appropriate. So I think it all starts with a logic model. We call it a product model in particular, just to differentiate it from maybe other types of logic models. So this is all laid out in the Evaluating Digital Health Products website. We describe how to run a workshop to create a product model with your team, or this is equally something you might do iteratively. So you might go back to that and revise the product model as your development continues. This is our very simple outline of what your product model looks like. It's more complicated than this in real life, but as a basic outline, you think, okay, what does my product do? Its functions. Those functions lead to some sort of response. The user acts because of that function, whether the user is a patient or a healthcare professional. That leads to some sort of outcome, and then we can think about outcomes in the short, medium, or long term. So my product does something, the user responds, that produces an outcome, which might lead to a medium-term outcome, which might lead to a long-term outcome. So that's our key logic that we want to flesh out. And then we've got these other boxes: hypothesis, assumptions, context, barriers, which are other things you should be thinking about around that line of logic. So, what's the sort of underlying hypothesis as to how your product works? What assumptions are you making about, say, the user? So, or the population that the users come from, what's the context you need to think about? So, this is within a particular healthcare system, and are there any barriers to this? So you can generate a product model diagram. In the old days, we just say, hey, stick things to a wall, use post-it notes. That's a good way for a team to sort of work out what they're doing. We developed this before the pandemic. During the pandemic, we obviously switched to using online tools where you can do similar things. So you're going to get something like this. I've got a example which is NHS Couch to 5K. But let's just go over this again because it's important. So the hypothesis, what problem are you trying to solve? What opportunity are you exploring? Your assumptions about the target audience, your context, who's the user, what are their motivations, what support do they have, what else are they doing, barriers, what might prevent someone from acting on what the digital health resource, the digital health tool says, what might prevent the affected individuals from achieving their desired health outcomes. So think about those things. But our main thing is this logic line in the middle. What are the specific things your digital health product does to encourage the user towards outcomes that will improve their health or their patient's health, depending whether your product is for a patient or a healthcare professional? How does user respond when engaging in your digital health tool? How would it change their behavior, for example? When we were developing this particular approach, I say this is before I was involved in the team. The team was talking to NHS Couch to 5K. You may be familiar with Couch 5K. It's an app. It was originally a podcast, and it encourages people to go from not doing any exercise to running regularly. So it's a very basic thing. It's not the sort of thing that would have to go through MHRA regulation, but we'll use it as an example. So how does NHS Couch 5K work? Well, it has a bunch of functions. So, for example, within the app, you can record what you've done. The app encourages you to go running. You go running, it records what you've done. So that's one of a number of functions. Okay, so why is it doing that function? Well, because of that function, the user feels encouraged because they can see their progress, and thus they're encouraged to continue with the program, which is going to move them up to doing more exercise until they're running a 5K. So we're laying out what is the logic of this function is going to produce this response. Because the user feels encouraged by their progress, they stay engaged with the app. So that's a short-term outcome. They keep using the app and they keep increasing their level of exercise week by week. In the medium term, that means they're going to get up to running a 5K and they're going to become fitter because they're doing this regular exercise. And that means in the long term, this should lead to maintenance of good fitness levels. The user will be fitter and thus less likely to suffer from poor health related to a lack of physical activity. So we're just laying out in straightforward terms, app does something, the user responds, this leads to outcomes. We want those outcomes. Ultimately, we want people to live a long, healthy life. Now, you may have a very different digital health product. You may have an AI tool to help radiologists interpret chest x-rays, but you can do the same thing. You can go, okay, well, the product does something. The user, in this case, a healthcare professional, responds to that, which means they diagnose quicker or they get more accurate diagnoses, which means that patients get better sooner or whatever. And by laying out those details, you can be very clear about what you're claiming, and that's going to be useful for any sort of evaluation, including for regulation. So, what does your product do? How are users going to respond? What are the outcomes? Once you've worked out what outcomes you expect, then that implies what you should be measuring or maybe qualitatively assessing in an evaluation. So I've said, oh, well, this app is going to get people exercising regularly. Okay, well, I'll assess that. I'll ask them, are they doing their exercise? I'm saying it's going to make them fitter. Okay, well, I can measure their fitness. Now, it may be that your product does many things. Most products do many things. So then you might need to say, okay, well, I can't look at every possible outcome that I'm expecting. I'm going to focus on the ones that matter most. So once you've done a product model, you've got a list of outcomes from that. You can then ask, well, what are the ones that really matter? What are the ones that are most important? You also might want to ask, well, what are the ones that are easy to measure? Maybe they're not the most important, but hey, evaluation is a pragmatic compromise. I can measure this. Maybe I've got data on it already. Great. So product model gives you a list of outcomes. Then you can go, what's important? What's easy to measure? And you can decide what outcomes to focus on in a particular evaluation. There might be all sorts of different measures you get: clinical, behavioral, psychological. Generally, you can look in the research literature and say, well, is there a sort of standard way of assessing this that other people use in research, and then generally safe to follow what others have done? Often we also need to think about short-term outcomes versus medium or long-term outcomes, because short-term outcomes are generally going to be easier to measure. We might sometimes call these proxy outcomes. So our long-term goal is people live a long, happy life, but our short-term goal is I got them to do more exercise in the short term, or I got a quicker diagnosis of lung cancer in my radiology tool, whatever it is. Now, this is a picture of an actual example from a workshop we did. This isn't, in fact, a completed one. But you can see it gets messy and complicated because digital health products often have a lot of functions, and functions each have a response, and some functions, you might have different functions that have the same response, and one function might have different responses, and then you might have different short-term, medium, and long-term outcomes. It gets messy and complicated. It's not just a single line of logic. It's like, well, hold on, there's a lot of things going on, which is why it's good to map it all out and make sure you know what you're doing, your team knows what they're doing, before we get into deciding on the details of an expensive evaluation. What I haven't answered yet is the trickier question of, okay, well, what method do I then use? You know, what's my study design for an evaluation, particularly when I'm getting regulatory approval? The Digital Health Products website has details of a bunch of different study designs. It's got a methods library, and it describes all sorts of different study designs, what they're good for, how they work, gives a case study for each one. So you can go and read up some details there. So, for example, there's a number of different descriptive studies you might be doing. I won't go into it now, but there's also a useful blog which Paulina wrote, which is on how to think about what evaluation method to choose once you've done your product model. So I'll leave that for you to read later. I also want to flag up that, particularly when we're getting to more complicated clinical evaluations, it's not just about you working out what you're doing. It's also about you working out what you're doing and then reporting what you're doing in a standardized way. And that can include both registering a protocol, saying this is what I'm going to do at the beginning of the study, and then using standard reporting guidelines to describe what you have done. And so I just want to flag up these resources as well. Consult is a set of reporting guidelines, and then there's a version of Consult for AI, and there's a version of Consult for e-health. Not a term we use so much these days, but digital health more generally. So those are also useful resources when we get into the details. I'm going to stop there. What I'd like to do is hand over to Gareth. Gareth's going to go into more detail and has some really interesting examples. Gareth.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Henry. Just to introduce myself, my name is Gareth. I'm a medical doctor by background and work at a company called Prova Health, where we run a number of things, but one of them being evaluations for digital health companies. And I lead our evaluations for digital health SMEs. Just to shift gear a little bit, I thought it was just important to highlight why this is so important. And this is a slide I come back to quite often. This, as you can see, is a little bit dated from 2022, but the message remains clear. There was this boom of digital health companies, and a lot of them hadn't actually generated the evidence to support the claims that they'd been making. And ultimately, this led to a bit of a digital health winter, where a lot of the solutions that had been developed didn't quite meet the claims that the manufacturers had made. But the regulators and other bodies are sharpening up to this, and there's been a lot of movement and discussion about this in the press recently. There's been a lot of discussion around AI and its move into digital health. And broadly speaking, you can understand the regulatory environment across the three larger markets, that being the UK. With Brexit, there was a historic move away from the EU, so it's reverted to the previous regulations, but that's being updated and hopefully should be released soon. The EU has this very challenging situation where you have to navigate the regulatory environment through the act as the EU MDR, and as well as this more broader AI Act, which gained a lot of press and a lot of discussion around that. And then the FDA is taking a bit of a different tack more recently, and in Jan, they've looked to try and down-regulate and make it more available for digital health companies to provide their solutions. So there's a lot of movement, it's a lot of complexity, but it's incredibly important for digital health solutions to be safe and effective. So Henry's touched on that, but what does this actually mean? What do you actually need? And regulatory needs can be split into essentially three core pillars. The first being clinical association. Is there a reason for your technology? Does it actually solve a clinical problem? The next will be your technical validation or analytical validation, where you look, does the software work reliably? Does it actually do what it's supposed to do? And then clinical performance. Well, how well does it solve this problem? And does it have a meaningful impact on the population that it's intended to be for? In addition to this, some of the more stringent regulatory requirements for some of your higher risk classes, such as your class 2B, usability testing is becoming essential, and it's a fundamental part that the notified bodies and the regulators are looking at. And broadly, this is split into two parts. Formative usability is very on in the iterative earlier process of the tool. You're looking at how does this actually work with the user, And then later, your summative usability is actually the formal evaluation that's tied to the safety of the device and understanding how it can be impacted and how the user's actually going to be using it in practice. So most devices under the regulatory environment will fall into Class 2A or Class 2B. This is an extract from the EU MDR, which is probably the most up-to-date in the UK and / EU setting and what most people should be aiming towards. Now, just moving on to the evidence, this is something that if there are a couple of clinicians in the audience or academics would be very familiar with this evidence pyramid and the idea that you can build more robust evidence depending on the type of study you can you conduct. And as was alluded to earlier, there's a number of different ways to go about it. But there's a lot of trade-offs in terms of, on the one hand, developing robust evidence and ensuring it answers the question that you're looking to solve, and the other, it being how much resources and time and money you're willing to spend to generate this evidence. And there'll be trade-offs for a lot of these different methodologies. Now, the evidence requirements for digital health products in terms of the regulatory landscape are always going to be ongoing. And what you're wanting to do is to evaluate your product as it matures, and you can build on the level of evidence that you've generated. So as the product's very early on, you can do some methods that are slightly more easier to implement and help you evaluate the product. And then as you gain more traction, you can start to use more comprehensive and robust methods. But we all know the reality of digital health in particular is not like that. The roadmap isn't this straight highway that you can build and gain traction and go on. So a lot of the way you need to go about this is being quite pragmatic and balancing those needs of demonstrating the evidence with the actual environment and context you find yourself in. So I think that's one of the key things to keep in mind, and that's what we've found. A lot of the tension that's produced is some of the earlier methodologies and the simpler ways to go about it is very quick, but doesn't generate robust evidence. On the other hand, your prospective randomized control trials, your prospective observational studies generate this really, really compelling and robust evidence, but they're very expensive. They take a lot of time, and oftentimes they're not necessarily as well suited to the iterative, fast nature of digital health. So you're left with this methodological gap in between the two sides. So what we found is that there's a lot of innovative and pragmatic approaches that you can use that I'm wanting to touch on and build on and how you can generate the correct evidence rapidly and robustly. So I just thought it would be helpful to take you through some of these methods. After that, we'll go into some case studies where we can look at some concrete examples of how these are being used in practice to help gain the evidence required for regulatory submissions. So just as a reminder, the three core pillars of regulation, and what you need is this clinical association. So does it solve the problem? This is slightly easier to do if you're working in a clinical environment. You'll sort of understand sort of the clinical challenges or technical challenges, or you can be engaging with people in that space to understand what are the sort of issues that they're facing on a day-to-day basis. What I'm going to be focusing on the other two is understanding from a technical standpoint how you can generate this evidence for digital health products, and the clinical performance, how you can show that your solution is having the impact that you want it to have on your target population. So the first is looking at something called synthetic data with human in the loop, and how this can be used to rapidly review an AI output. So one of the key challenges is that the amount of data that AI and digital health solutions are producing is increasing exponentially, and it becomes incredibly difficult to evaluate these outputs rapidly. So a way to go about this is essentially, step one is you generate some synthetic data. So this will be data that will emulate what a population would look like, or some of the evidence of some of the data that would be found wherever your solution is being deployed. What you can then do is run your solution on that data to see what it would look like in an environment that's quite similar. And what you then do is have an expert reviewing the outputs of your solution to see, does it meet the standard? From this, you can build up a validated set of outputs that can help you to either further retrain your model, or continue to validate it. So this is quite a nice way to go about validating AI outputs or digital health outputs quite rapidly for analytical validation. The next methodology is something that we do quite a lot of. It's something called clinical simulation. And what clinical simulation is essentially you take the end user, so this might be a doctor, it might be a patient, a technician, whoever your solution is aimed at, and you place them in a high fidelity scenario. So a situation that would represent what their usual working environment would have the same sort of time pressures, same sort of resource constraints that they would typically be accustomed to. Then what you can do is, using some of the synthetic data that you've generated, you can allow them to use your solution on some fictitious patients or fictitious data sets that is representative of what your typical cohort would look like. And this allows you to get a sense of how is your solution actually going to be working in an environment that is similar to one that it's going to be deployed in. And above that, it has a lot of additional advantages. The first being privacy, so you're not having to expose sensitive patient information to clinicians while you're trying to test your device. The next is it's quite inclusive. So what you can do is include underrepresented users, or those with who would typically be excluded from your usual trials, or those who there isn't sufficient data on. Because you're able to generate the data set yourself, you're able to include those populations and make it more representative of what your typical cohort would be. And finally, this is nice because it's auditable and it's very structured. So your data is captured in a structured manner that you're able to then analyze quite efficiently. So just to build on this clinical simulation methodology, our Chief Medical Officer, Sarah Kafashi, is a respiratory consultant, and she helped to develop this Delphi consensus on using this methodology for the regulation of software as a medical device. And it came up with this framework, the CIRUS framework, that can help you to take this method and leverage it for your regulatory submission. Then finally, I'll get to the questions after this, if that's all right. The retrospective and silent trial design. This is quite a nice methodology for those that are looking for either diagnostics or risk prediction models in the digital health space, because what you're able to do is look at historic data and take your solution and run that historic data through your solution and see what would it have produced, what sort of outputs, compare that to typically what you would want as your gold standard or the standard of care. And therefore, you're able to demonstrate how your solution would actually look like, would actually perform on a real world data set. Silent trial design is very similar in nature. But what you would do is have your solution implemented, and where there would be a notification or an output of your solution, that's hidden from the end user. And what you're able to do then is look at what is the sort of the outcome that your solution has produced versus what happened in the real world. And this ensures that you're able to get some sense of the impact of the actual real world scenario, and it doesn't put any patients at risk or doesn't necessarily change the care because the end user is not actually getting the notification. So quite a nice, smart way to go about it to get the true reflection of the performance of your intervention. Then the question, sorry, on the last slide regarding randomization on the previous protocol, can go back to that quickly, is just to say randomization will very much depend. This was a extract from a study where we used within subjects. So the subjects were exposed to both the intervention and the control to try and increase the sample size of it. I guess you could have randomization, but it would just depend on what are the objectives of the evaluation that you're looking to do. So now we're just going to go into a couple of case studies that's going to just demonstrate some of the methodologies that I've explored in actual real life settings and how they've been used to help generate the evidence. So the first is looking at analytical validation, and the setting here, just to give you a bit of context, is the solution helps to generate summaries and consolidate clinical guidelines for clinicians to ensure that they have the most up-to-date, accurate information for the care of the patient. As I alluded to, one of the big challenges of this is that the number of outputs that you can generate from this increases exponentially because you're simply able to ask as many questions or get as many summaries as you want. So how can you efficiently evaluate the outputs of this at scale? So what we did here was, using that human in the loop validation technique, we built a custom validation interface. And what that did was allowed the output of the AI to be pulled up next to our validation tool to have our experts to rapidly review the outputs and then validate it according to the set criteria that we've set for this intervention. The big bonus of this is, because it's now custom built and bespoke for this validation, the data is all structured. You don't have any errors in terms of transcription in spreadsheets, and you're able to see which experts have said exactly what for each of the outputs. The next is the clinical simulation. So for that same intervention that we were discussing in the previous slide, a tool that summarizes guidelines or answers questions based on the most recent guidelines. We are conducting a clinical simulation. So what we're doing is we're taking the end users, GPs, and placing them in a realistic clinical scenario. So what it would look like if they were using their tool in their clinical practice to answer questions about patients, to answer questions about guidelines, etc. We're using cases that are high fidelity, so they represent what a GP would typically see in their day-to-day consultations. Additionally, we're using some edge cases because what we're wanting to show is not only do these solutions work for the 80 to 90% of cases, but they also work for the fringe cases where you would have a more likelihood of something being either ordinary or something going wrong because it's not typically seen in practice. And finally, the nice part of this methodology is that we're using this throughout the regulatory process. So it's using for class 1 submission, and then it can also be used for class 2A submission at a later stage if the solution wants to expand and requires that. I just thought I would just point you to a paper that just recently came out that actually goes into a lot more detail on how we use this methodology to evaluate an LLM tool for clinical decision support in oncology. The paper wasn't for regulatory purposes, but I think if you're wanting to have a look at some actual practical steps on how we went about it, it's a nice resource to have, because the same methods can be applied for the regulatory process as well. And then finally, I wanted to speak on how retrospective data can be used for Class 2B regulatory approval. So relatively recently, a company called Sonome have a tool called Memory, which is the first UK-built AI software to receive Class 2B for infection prediction. So what they did was they used retrospective observational cohort study, and as you can see from the diagram on the right, essentially what they did was looked at all the historic data of the patients. So you can see it from the numbers, 800 patients, 4,000 observations over 4 years, and they demonstrated that their intervention increases the detection of infection by up to 72 hours. So how that was structured is essentially you can look at all of this historic data. You can see, okay, well, what does the standard of care News 2 alert say? When would it predict infection in a patient? And then you'll have what their tool would have when their tool would have actually alerted the patient, and then you can see the change in the time period, and that gives you this highlighted window of opportunity where you have more opportunity to intervene with the patient. So I thought quite a nice example about how retrospective data can be used to gain your Class 2B, so relatively higher risk class regulatory approval. So we'll take a couple of questions. I saw there were a couple of questions in the chat, but happy to answer any questions after the panel discussion. My email's on the screen now, so feel free to reach out if you're wanting more details on anything I've discussed today.